Welcome to another edition of Papa's Perspective. I'm Bob Papa, and Papa's Perspective is brought to you by Bob's Discount Furniture, the official furniture store and mattress partner of the New York Giants. And, as the Giants celebrate 100 years, the list of the top 100 has been released. And I thought it'd be a great idea to have one of the voters as our blue ribbon panel. Peter King takes a couple minutes to join us. Peter, thank you so much for your time. And more importantly, thank you for partaking in this unique exercise in trying to identify the top 100 players of over the 5,000 men that have worn a Giants uniform for this year's 100 season celebration.
Bob, it was not easy, as you well know. And I've had the privilege for really over 30 years to be one of the voters for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And this really was a totally different animal than voting for the Pro Football Hall of Fame, because most of the time when you're voting for members in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, except if you're voting for a senior, and and then you have to compare, Maxie Bond to Sterling Sharp to to the real old timers, and you have to think of, well, should Clark Shaughnessy be in and things like that. But most of the time when you're voting for the modern era candidates in the NFL, they're guys who you know very well. And you've seen play, and you know an awful lot about them, and you can judge them against their peers. What was really hard about this is, obviously, you know that Mel Hein belongs on the list, but how do you compare Mel Hein to Homer Jones? And then how do you compare Homer Jones to Amani Toomer? And so that became a real difficult challenge for me. And I have to tell you, Bob, the way I voted is I probably erred on the side of history a little bit more than I would think most voters. And in part because I just think I remember when I was a kid growing up in Northern Connecticut, my family, they were huge Giants fans. We watched the games out of Hartford every Sunday on Channel 3, the CBS affiliate there in Hartford, and we wouldn't miss a game. And so I probably am more fond, for instance, of guys like Bob Tucker and Ron Johnson. And I have great regard for Alex Webster. And, and I did, although I didn't see Frank Gifford play, I just have high regard for pro football history. So I probably erred on the side of history a little bit more than a lot of the people who voted.
We started with a ballpark list of about 115, and some of the voters were encouraged in case there were some names that might have been missed. So people were added to the ballot. I think at the end of the day, there were about 125 or so names to choose from. And what we tried to do is we started the voting process with, I directed the group to say, let's work on the first 25. You can't do this 100 at a time. So
Yeah.
let's take this in segments. And we started with the first 25. So everybody on the ballot is eligible for the first 25. And then everybody submitted their votes. I created a point value. Whoever was put number one on someone's ballot got 25 points, and we worked it on through. And, it was interesting because now you got to do a little research on these guys. I was one of the people that encouraged to be added to the ballot Tom Landry, because I started looking at Tom Landry as a player. And I think he's still fourth on the Giants all-time interception list. And now it was great, like trying to figure out how to do this. But we came to what was a consensus 25, and then we worked backwards from 26 to 50. So, guys that got a lot of votes for the top 25 but didn't make the cut, now you're looking at them in your next grouping. But, I think the final list is awesome in the sense that Roosevelt Brown and Mel Hein finished 2 and 3, and Emlyn Tennell finished 6th, who still leads the franchise in interceptions. So I think the voters got it right, by not getting too swept up in age bias.
Yeah, I think so too. I was really really happy to see that on the final list. And look, there's a lot of there's a lot of people. You know, one of the other things about a list like this, Bob, is there's probably people who look at it and say, geez, all the immortals in Giants history, what's Lawrence Tynes doing on this list? And all that. But I say that this had to be a list about great moments in Giants history. Okay. And I think one of the things that I think is really, really important, okay, when you talk about Giants history, is you have to realize that there were so many huge games played by the New York Giants, so many big games played by the Giants. And when you think about it, all of so many of these big games, and I'm kind of looking back at, games that the team that I covered in the 80s played. And you might say, well, geez, you probably were a little bit, there's probably a little bit more of a nod to teams from the 80s and obviously 90 or 91. But the thing that I always say to people about looking at particularly a team's history, I think you have to make a judgment. There might be some people who will look at this list and who will say, I mean, look, I don't mind necessarily having Gary Reasons on this, but to have Gary Reasons, in the 70s, to have him ahead of some of the all-time greats and all that. And and I just think to myself, and Bob, you would know this because you know Giants history better than I do. But when I think of Gary Reasons, I think of his role in the incredible Giants playoff run to winning the Super Bowl in 1990, when I think a lot of us thought, well, they got no business winning the Super Bowl, and going out to San Francisco and playing maybe the best 49er team, the deepest 49er team they ever had, and holding the 49ers to 13 points, and Gary Reasons forcing that huge fumble late in the game and playing a huge game in that game. But anyway, I was happy to see that there are players on this list, and relatively high on this list, that I think had a collection of moments and were part of some rock-ribbed important teams. And Gary Reason's a part of 2 Super Bowl winning teams. So I just think that everybody's going to have questions about why certain people landed high on the list. But I really think that the moments that so many of these players had really helped them get on this list and helped them get high on this list.
Yeah, and one of the things that we talked about as a group or discussed via email was, okay, the Giants are fortunate enough to have a lot of members of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So immediately, if you're in the Hall of Fame, you better be on the top 100 Giants list, right? If your career as a Giant qualified you to get in the Hall of Fame, then it was for guys that had shorter tenures in that time were they unbelievably special. As an example, Odell Beckham Jr. did things his rookie season. His numbers, I mean, he has 44 touchdown catches, which is 10 less than Amani Toomer, and he did it in less than half the time. For his 5 years as a Giant, you have to say he's one of the greatest Giants of all time. A guy had fans coming at me on Twitter saying, how could you put Odell Beckham Jr. on the list? Because he was dominant as a Giant.
Yeah.
Fran
Oh,
Tarkington, in his years as the quarterback of the Giants, did things that Giant quarterbacks haven't done since, as far as Pro
right.
Bowls and stuff like that. So I think the committee did a really nice job of figuring out longevity, Hall of Fame um, guys who have set Giants records as opposed to guys who maybe played for a shorter period of time, like a Homer Jones, who still leads the NFL in yards per catch,
Yeah.
invented the spike. And until Odell Beckham Jr. went to a Pro Bowl, the Giants didn't have a receiver to go to a Pro Bowl since Homer Jones. That has to factor into this.
I think so too. You know, there are those on this list, and Bob, in looking at this list now, I'll nitpick three players on this list. Number one, I'll nitpick Fran Tarkenton being 33. I think Fran Tarkenton deserved to be significantly higher. I think at a time in Giants history where they were sort of teetering on the brink, post Y.A. Tittle and all that, where they're sort of teetering on the brink of trying to be good, and yet they still really owned greater New York and all of New England. I really thought he should have been a little bit higher. And, the one other person on this list that I really felt because of, and I'm going to look at history a little bit, I felt should have been higher was Spider Lockhart. And I think we all, sort of know the name Carl Spider Lockhart because it's probably the greatest nickname in the history of the Giants, Spider Lockhart. And that's how he became known. But I just think he was a really vital player to some great defenses for a long time. So if I have nits to pick, those would probably be the two where I'd start.
Yeah, Spider Lockhart wound up coming in 49th
Yeah,
in
and
this
and
list.
and Fran was 33rd.
Right. But
Yeah.
then you think about, like the Dick Lynches of the world who finished a little bit higher, led the league in interceptions a couple of times. Everybody remembers him as the lovable broadcaster. He
Yeah.
was an incredible player. Jimmy Patton is a name that is not as big, but his resume is off the charts.
Right.
I love the fact that the committee remembered John Mendenhall.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. That was great. Because obviously, look, I say this about the Hall of Fame all the time. Like I refer to people like Tommy Nobis, okay? Tommy Nobis played for the Atlanta Falcons, was a really good middle linebacker. Very much he was on Dick Butkus's level. But everybody sort of forgot about him because the Atlanta Falcons were a new team. They stunk. Where the Chicago Bears were the monsters of the Midway. And hey, look, Dick Butkus deserves to be in the Hall of Fame unanimously on the first ballot, obviously. But I think sometimes if you don't play for a winning team, it ends up really penalizing you. And I think the committee, without backpatting too much, I think the committee did a good job of understanding that there were a lot of great players on a lot of bad Giants teams.
Yeah, Jesse Armstead, although his team did get to the Super Bowl, played on a lot of bad teams in the 90s, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and some of those players from the 70s were acknowledged. I'm happy that the committee acknowledged what Brad Van Pelt was as a player
Yeah.
and how good Brian Kelly was playing on horrible teams. It's easy to go with Harry Carson. He's in the
Yeah.
Hall of Fame. He was the captain, won a Super Bowl. But there's that core of guys from the non-winning teams that the committee really understood. And I think that's why we had that great cross section in kind of doing this. As you prepared for this and as you work through it, what was one of the fun things that maybe you uncovered in all of this?
I mean, I'll tell you two things I really enjoyed about the process. Number one, look, I'm not ashamed to say that for an awful lot of these guys, I used Pro Football Reference, I used Wikipedia for some. You've got to, we all have to acknowledge the fact that it's going to be pretty hard for us to have a great handle on the career of Ward Cuff. You know,
Or Tuffy
and
Lehman's?
yeah, Tuffy Lehman's. Like to me, I think one of the things you have to realize when you start to look at players who obviously are way before your time. I mean, Ward Cuff was probably born 110 years ago. But you have to look at guys, and you only the one thing I've always thought that you really have to do is you have to compare players to guys in their own eras. Okay. And so that's easy to say, okay, but you have to really do that. And so therefore, you know, Ward Cuff started playing for the Giants in sometime in the 30s. And so you have to just look at his career, and you have to basically say, okay, who does he compare to? Was he outstanding in his in his era? And so that's how you have to judge players, like in my opinion. You can't say, well, Ward Cuff was, he had a weird combo platter of being, a halfback and a kicker. And because in those days, in the first 20 years of football, you didn't have many guys on your team, and the more you could do, the better you were. And so I look at guys like that, and I think that when you have to make judgments, you have to remember history. And the one other guy that I was really happy to see on the list, and I personally absolutely loved putting him on my ballot, was Brad Benson. So Brad Benson's not going to make the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He's not going to probably, if you look at the length and breadth of Giants history, he's not going to necessarily stand out really in any era, even in the 80s when the Giants got to their 2 Super Bowls in 1990. But what I remember about Brad Benson oh so well is what an irreplaceable part he was on an offensive line that started, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Bob, 37 games in a row, including playoff games. And was, even though no player on that line was what you would call in any way a singularly dominant player, it was just a great example of how team play leads to great things. That was a great team offensive line, and yet not a soul on that line will ever get a vote to go to Canton. And even though, it was a Super Bowl winning offensive line. So I appreciated, even though Brad Benson was 99th, okay, on this list, I'm just glad he made it. He should be on the list. Brad Benson is what this sport is about. It's about players who do exactly what their coaches say and become really important and vital players on championship teams. So that's the other one I was really happy about, and was really kind of fun to judge, against other great Giants in history.
So just in kind of recapping here, we did 1 through 25, and whoever got a first place vote got 25 points. Whoever got a second place vote got 24. I took all the ballots. I added up the point totals. That's how we got to consensus, 1 to 25. Then we did the same thing for 26 to 50. Whoever got the most votes in that group, 25 points. So that's how this list was. We didn't debate it. We didn't negotiate it.
Right.
We didn't roundtable it. And you had given me the advice of, the Hall of Fame. The vote is the vote. And you're asking people to give their opinions and make their votes. The Hall of Fame voting is not open for discussion. You may debate players in that room.
Right.
But at the end of the day, once you come up with your list, you don't say, well, you know what, we should add or move this one or move that one.
Yeah.
Which I think made it as democratic as humanly possible. Can you just talk a little bit about number 2? Because the race, listen, we all know that Lawrence Taylor is number 1, but the point total between Lawrence Taylor and Roosevelt Brown was not as slam dunk. It's not like it was neck and neck, but Roosevelt Brown got his props. And I try to explain to younger fans today, he was the Jonathan Ogden of his era, to
Yeah.
use a modern day player as an example. Um, and I think number two is the perfect spot for Roosevelt Brown.
Yeah, I think one of the things I like about the placement of Roosevelt Brown is that when you think about it, Bob, this was one of those guys, and and Wellington Mara, Roosevelt Brown in the 50s came out in the draft. I think it's sometime in the early 50s, I forget what year. Okay, so when he came out in the draft, it came out afterwards that he was one of those players who, because he played at Morgan State, a historically black school, and because he played at Morgan State, the Giants, I'm sure, didn't scout him or know very much about him. A lot of what was known in those days about prospects in the early history of the early modern history of the league was done through like football magazines.
Right.
And he got a lot of really positive uh, comments in football magazines about guys from small colleges who could play in the NFL. Giants picked him, I don't know what, 20th. I forget what round it was, but they picked him way down the line. And I think what was really cool about his career, okay, like he was all pro 6 or 7 times, and he was in the Pro Bowl every year. And yet at that time, the Giants were battling the Colts and then the Packers for league supremacy. And they needed a dominant tackle to make their running game go. And I just think, the one other thing about Roosevelt Brown that I appreciated is someone who actually voted on the NFL's 75-year team. This was probably 30 years ago, I think it was. Roosevelt Brown made it. And so imagine that you're saying that this guy in the first 75 years was one of the best offensive linemen ever to play in the NFL. And when you hear that, and when you realize that, you realize that this guy was one of the first really big men, whatever, 6'4", 260, whatever he was. And then later, I got to know him as a scout when he was a scout for the Giants in the 80s. And he'd come around training camp all the time. I would see him and talk to him. He's a really nice fellow. But I just think that made me happy because it was a nod toward all eras of the Giants. And it wasn't like, okay, we're putting Harry Carson, Michael Strahan, and Eli Manning and Phil Simms. We're putting them all in the top 6 or 7. That's no good list. You have to have a nod to history. And Roosevelt Brown 2, Mel Hein 3, Emlyn Tennell 6, Andy Robustelli 10. I mean, that is a nod to the fact that I think this committee respected history and really wanted to identify the truly great Giants of yesterday.
Yeah, and obviously Eli is in his first year of eligibility, and there's a chance somewhere down the road he winds up in the Hall of Fame. But the 9 others that make the top 10 for a franchise that has 100 years of history and 8 championships and championship game appearances, you have to have Hall of Famers in the top 10. It would be almost a derelict of duty to not have
Right.
Hall of Famers in the top 10. Peter, I want to thank you so much for taking part in this exercise of voting on this. I know it was a lot of work. Your busy schedule with, at the time, you having a full-time schedule. But, I think it's an unbelievable list. It's a debatable list. People can chatter about it all they want, but your time and effort, your guidance in helping me chair this committee, I appreciate it very much. And thanks for joining us on this podcast.
Hey, sounds great, Bob. I really appreciate you asking me. It was an honor to be on the committee.
That wraps it up for this edition. For Peter King, I'm Bob Papa of Papa's Perspective, brought to you by Bob's Discount Furniture, the official furniture store and mattress partner of the New York Football Giants.